Salutations, fellow consumers of sandwiches! You may have heard that the Democratic Party is just a few months away from collapsing in on itself in a sacrifice ritual that we in America call a primary. Given that the first caucus happens on February 3rd and my state votes on March 3rd, that's Super Tuesday, I was hoping to get some sort of potentially vote-swaying video out as fast as possible so as to reach people before the important elections. Ideally, this would be short, accessible, easily digestible. Then I started writing. There were a few kinds of videos I considered, mainly like a 10-minute standard endorsement video where I list the myriad of reasons I'm supporting. Shh, don't say his name. But I figured there's really one big threat to him that I should focus on. It's not the giant centrism squad that seems to think it's possible to compromise with Republicans. It's not the idea that policies like Medicare for all or college for all are too far left for the average voter. It's the fact that there are two candidates in the race promising those kinds of policies, but one of them pretends to be bolder than they actually are. And that person is Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now for all the Warren fans to click off the video.
If you've clicked on this video, you probably fall into one of three categories. A, you're an Elizabeth Warren supporter looking to hear out or perhaps argue with a Bernie supporter. B, you're a Bernie Sanders supporter and you're looking for 12,000 more reasons to tell people he's the best candidate. Or C, you have no fucking clue what's happening and you just saw that the funny bird book man made another video. Neat. To a degree, this video's aimed at all of you, which means I'm kinda all over the place with my goals here. Am I trying to convince lefties who support Warren that Bernie's the better choice? Am I trying to arm Bernie supporters with the info they need to convince Warren supporters to reconsider? Am I trying to grab the few lefties that aren't really sure which of the two to support? Or am I just venting a ton of irrational rage about the fact that the guy I like is considered interchangeable with someone demonstrably different from him across multiple vectors? Yes, yes, yes. Oh, you fucking know it. I'll acknowledge this video is excessively long because I'm an indulgent bastard, so there are time codes in the description linking to each chapter if you want to skip to specific policies. If you've made it this far but you've just realized you don't have time to watch a video longer than an hour, Kyle Kalinske has a more casual video covering a few topics I don't talk about in this one. It's not a replacement for my video, but it's worth a watch as a companion piece or if you're just short on time.
There's this persisting perception that because Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are the two most prominent progressives in this race, that they're the same. That electing either of them would create roughly the same vision for America. That Warren is just female Bernie, but with a deeper focus on policy or whatever.
She's got a plan for that!
And I don't completely blame people for thinking that way. Most people don't spend their entire lives on Twitter shrieking about electoral politics because they actually have lives. So their knowledge comes from what the media or experts have to say, which has been, by and large, Sanders and Warren are the same. Lucky for you, I'm terminally online, which means I'm smarter than every news organization put together, and I'm here to tell you why they're wrong. Alright, let me clarify myself for a second here. I don't completely believe Elizabeth Warren to be a bold-faced liar who won't deliver on any of her promises. Only kinda. But I do think that, like virtually every other candidate in this pool, she isn't near as bold or far-reaching as she could and should be. The difference between Warren and a centrist like Pete Buttigieg is that Mayor Pete spends all day talking about how we gotta be humble and we can't go too far left because we gotta keep the party unified, while Warren takes watered-down versions of left-wing ideas and casts them as the boldest possible thing we can do.
You know, I don't understand why anybody goes to all the trouble of running for president of the United States just to talk about what we really can't do and shouldn't fight for.
She claims to be one of the only ones offering big structural change, but the change she offers is still just a less bold version of what a certain socialist is already saying. She and Bernie are different not only in how their policies are structured, but in the overall core messages of their campaigns. And if you look deeper, as much as she calls herself a progressive warrior, Warren toes the typical congressional line on way more issues than you think.
Obviously, I'm voting for Bernie, but I will say that Warren is my second choice and has been since the beginning of the race. But as the campaign has progressed and I've learned more about her actual history and she's pivoted more to the center, the gap between Warren and Bernie has been widening more and more. So let's amend that title real quick.
All right, so we got a long list here. Climate change, Medicare for all, housing, college debt, foreign policy and immigration, and wealth taxation. Oh God! I should note that I'm not bringing up queer and race issues, not because that's my privileged blind spot as a cis straight white male, but because they don't really have any stated differences on those fronts. I will point out, however, that Bernie marched in the civil rights movement in the 60s and fought for gay and trans rights in Vermont in the 80s, while Warren was a registered Republican until 1996. Not that she is or was a bigot for that reason alone, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds it a little iffy that she was a Republican in the Reagan era. It's fine, I'm sure we can excuse the Harvard law professor for not understanding politics until her late 40s. Anyway, into the juicy shit.
First of all, if you trust Greenpeace, this should say enough. And that's not a microscopic difference of 1 or 2 points. That's 7 points out of 100. It was 9 when I recorded this line. It's changed. She's better now.
Okay, you've heard everyone and their scientist uncle say this, but climate change is the problem of our generation, and it is unquestionably a problem born of capitalism. If companies weren't incentivized by the system to pollute the environment because fossil fuels are cheaper to use than any other energy resource, and we weren't incentivized to do the same thing because it costs a metric fuck ton to be environmentally conscious, we wouldn't have this problem. Do you have an electric car, Jonathan? No, you don't, because that shit's expensive. It's not your job to limit your personal carbon footprint by paying exorbitant amounts of money. It's the fault of wealthy CEOs and companies who invariably cause us to contribute to pollution every day, because the system is the driver of climate change, not any one person. And given that climate change is a capitalism-driven problem, even if he and Warren's plans were the same, Bernie Sanders would be the better climate candidate by simple virtue of the fact that he calls himself a socialist. He challenges the very system that created the problem in the first place, while she just calls it an issue of corruption. Which it definitely is, but you have to ask what system incentivizes that corruption. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum.
Now let's talk about the actual plans. First of all, Elizabeth Warren has endorsed the Green New Deal, as introduced by Congresswoman and famous Donkey Kong 64 streamer Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This is an objectively good thing on the part of the senator, but ultimately meaningless when you A, realize she sponsored Bernie's Medicare for All bill long before backpedaling heavily on that, and B, actually look at the contents of the Warren plan. Let me sum up my problem with the Warren climate plan in one word: markets. Click here to read more about Elizabeth's plan to use market forces to speed the transition to clean energy, without spending a dime of taxpayer money. Elizabeth, there were 18 tropical storms this year. I don't give a shit if my taxes go up $12. The Warren plan is complex, as any climate plan should be, but a massive portion of it lies in depending on accountable capitalism to solve the problem. A component that best exemplifies this is her idea for a Green Marshall Plan, which would see the US government brokering trade deals so private companies would be able to sell climate-friendly energy products to foreign countries at low prices.
She wants to beat climate change through subsidies. I really don't have the time to use my facts and logic ray to explain why this is bad, but I will tell you this is how we've been doing the foreign arms trade for years, which has granted inordinate amounts of political power to weapons companies for longer than we've all been alive. I'm not saying granting influence to green energy companies is near as bad as the actual military-industrial complex, but handing political power over to any corporate entity is a bad thing. Like we know that, right? Thinking we as a species can be saved by harnessing the invisible hand of the market is clearly a misguided way to look at the issue, considering the invisible hand and the invisible cuntbags behind it are why climate change is happening in the first place. A few other parts of the plan follow this same sort of logic. For example, her climate risk disclosure plan would require companies to publish info about how they would be affected by climate change in the long term, which would motivate shareholders theoretically to divest from energy companies in order to make them transition to clean energy faster, because it suddenly affects their bottom line. Which isn't necessarily a bad concept in theory, but it's not like companies and their investors don't realize they're fucking the environment, they just don't care. Also, why are you using the stock market to fight climate change when you can just regulate the companies? Holy God! The rest of the plan is mostly solid if you strip away all the focus on markets. She funnels billions into research and development of better energy technology. She reinstates the Obama-era water and air protections that Trump instantly devoured in his presidency. And of course, she rejoins the Paris Climate Accord. But the level of investment in all of those things that Bernie's plan also does, is about
10.7 trillion.
Bernie's is 16.3 trillion. And that's a lazy segue into the Sanders climate plan, a plan that doesn't put a ton of stock into using the market to fix the problem. Ideologically, the plan is completely different, implementing various national programs to take on the climate instead of dumping billions into the economy for it to sort it out.
The core example of this should be an obvious move: declaring climate change a national emergency. This would grant the presidency extra authority in doing things like issuing instant temporary regulations or placing a freeze on oil drilling. Thankfully, Warren has also said she would declare climate change a national emergency. In February. And never again after that. It's not even on her website.
She did back a resolution to declare a national emergency that was introduced by Bernie and AOC, so it's disingenuous to say she doesn't support this, but again, I need to stress, this isn't part of her campaign's official climate plan, at least according to her website.
On the front of international cooperation, instead of selling our tech to other countries all arms trade, please become beholden to American companies style, Bernie's plan would invest billions in the United Nations Green Climate Fund. This seems like a pretty important move to me if the US is to take the global lead on climate, but Warren's plan doesn't do that. Her version of international cooperation is to make other countries buy shit from us, instead of directly funding the global development and transfer of the technologies we need.
Warren's climate plan is absolutely better than everyone except Bernie's. You'll notice this is a trend. But it doesn't mobilize the full resources of our government to fight the thing that, let me repeat, is going to kill us! Obviously, the global response to the climate has just been endless waffling with no action in sight, and we have not been leaders in that discussion whatsoever. So maybe we shouldn't vote for the person whose plan, as governmenty and expensive as it is, still depends on the free fucking market to save us from dying in a fiery inferno that market created. Maybe a massive price tag and some level of government overreach is exactly what we need, actually? Maybe? Bernie Sanders is objectively the bolder candidate in fighting this, the existential threat of our lifetime, and given that you and I are gonna fucking die from it, there's really only one candidate to vote for. Alright, I know this is a big ticket issue, but this is gonna be real mathy, so strap in.
First thing to note, when you see news articles talking about Warren's signature policy, Medicare for All, or when you see debate moderators ask her about universal healthcare and not Bernie, that's what we in the political science sphere call fucking dishonest. Obviously, Bernie didn't invent the idea of single-payer healthcare, but he did coin the term Medicare for All, and he... And whether you like him or not, you have to acknowledge that his 2016 campaign is the reason we're talking about healthcare in this primary at all. All that in mind, Warren's approach to healthcare hasn't exactly been as a single-payer warrior. She didn't actually release her healthcare plan until this past November. Before that, she endorsed Bernie's plan, and she floundered on it a lot. For most of the early campaign, she was with Bernie and saying that taxes would go up, but the decline in premiums would mean everyone would save money. Then during the October debate, she got hammered a ton with the incredibly simple "how do we pay for it" question, and proceeded to backpedal a day later by, quote, looking into new revenue streams. She later released an all-new plan using different methods altogether that no longer resembled the Bernie plan she previously endorsed, declaring that it, quote, does not raise taxes on the middle class, unquote, which, as we'll see later, is as much of a fucking lie as calling it Medicare for All.
So when the media is screaming, oh, look at Warren, she's running on all these progressive far-left ideas, maybe consider how she's treated those ideas in the past and consider why the media might be favoring her over the candidate whose policies would hurt their profits more. Of course, now both candidates have released detailed policy plans about how we're going to get everyone covered under the same government-funded healthcare, which is good. But although these plans ostensibly have the same goal in mind, the way they get there is pretty fundamentally different.
The main flaw in the Warren healthcare plan is its timeline. Her plan doesn't introduce actual Medicare for all as a bill until the third year of her first term, instead relying on a Buttigieg-style public option for the first 3 years. The plan contains 2 distinct bills. First, a public option is passed, then true single-payer is theoretically passed in the third year. A public option isn't a sustainable system because it means that working people will all be on the same government healthcare plan while rich people will all be on expensive private ones, continuing the tiered system we have now where the richer you are, the better healthcare you get. The continued existence of private insurance decentivizes the government from adequately funding the public option.
But hey, that's just the transition period. Bernie's bill has one too. Isn't the important thing the end goal, regardless of how we get there? And yeah, okay, I'll accept the theory that she's being more pragmatic about it because she's being more gradual. Fine, I'll accept that. But while we're talking about being more strategic, can we also talk about how... So let's say the 2020 election goes absolutely perfectly. Democrats keep the House, they take the Senate, we've got a full, bleeding heart, blue majority Congress. That'd be a pretty solid foundation to pass lefty policy during a full 4-year Democratic presidency, right? Except for the fact that we've got this thing called midterms. In 2022, roughly 2 years under the next president's belt, the entirety of the House and about a third of the Senate will be up for re-election, giving the Republicans the chance to retake one chamber of Congress. And if the last 30 years of politics are any indication, the GOP will retake the House if we don't successfully pass policy and campaign enough to actually motivate turnout in the midterms, which historically no one votes in. So let's assume the House is destined to go red, because it probably is. That gives us 2 concrete years to pass legitimate left-wing policy without obstruction. That includes a complete overhaul of the healthcare system.
Warren's plan does this genius fucking thing where it doesn't actually implement a single-payer bill until 2023. You know, after the Republicans take the House. Again, that's not we pass a single-payer bill in the first year that contains a 3-year transition period. That's 2 separate bills for an immediate public option vote and then a vote on single-payer at year 3. As much as she'd like to brag about being one of the only ones who supports real Medicare for all, in practice, Warren's plan is closer to Buttigieg's Medicare for all who want it bullshit. This shift in timeline is dumb enough that her new Medicare for All plan was slammed as a pivot away from Medicare for All, which has done absolute wonders for her in the polls. What a surprise! Supporting a shitty version of Medicare for All pisses off both the people who like Medicare for All and the people who hate it. This is someone with an eye for political strategy.
She's been rushing to the center, particularly on healthcare, for pretty much the entirety of this video's production, so don't be surprised if everything I just said is even worse by the time this is actually uploaded. On the flip side, Bernie's plan says, hey Congress, vote on this shit in the first heckin' week. Assuming things go our way in the congressional elections, which they almost definitely will, Bernie would have a Democratic Congress ready to debate and vote on single payer immediately, which is objectively better than the plan of passing it after the Republicans have taken the House, where they can say, fuck you, we're not passing this, regardless of what the bill actually is and how left it is. So without even going into how to pay for it, we know Bernie's plan is the one more likely to pass in Congress just because of his strategy alone. But in the interest of being comprehensive, let's do some fucking math.
Okay, this bit's gonna be mildly complicated and jargon-ridden, but stay with me for a second. Warren's plan what the fuck? Warren's plan uses something called an employer head tax as its main revenue stream. In this case, that means companies have to pay $9,500 for every employee they have. That's with a capital E. No, I'm not splitting hairs, Jeremy. That'll be important later. Basically, if company A employs 100 people, it pays $950,000 in healthcare taxes. If company B employs 1,000 people, it pays $9.5 million. This holds true unless a company employs 50 people or less, in which case it's completely exempt from the tax. On the surface, whatever, it's fine. It's a bunch of bullshit tax terms no one actually cares about. But the problem with this is the same one you'll find with any flat numeric tax. The poorer you are, the more the tax will hurt you. As an adult, $100 can't pay your healthcare bill, but as a kid, that's like almost 2 whole video games.
The way we fix this is by making the tax proportionate to the amount that's being taxed. Higher amounts get taxed more, lower amounts get taxed less. It's the basic principle of progressive taxation. The Warren head tax doesn't even pass that basic hurdle. The tax per employee is the same regardless of the company's size or profits. Randy's Bakery is viewed the same as Amazon, the only difference being how many people they employ. You'd think Amazon would have to pay just a little more, but the only difference is it's got more people. The profits don't matter. Randy's Bakery it's losing money on every sale. I'm going on a tangent. This wasn't in the script. On top of this, the tax is based solely on the number of employees, that's again with a capital E, in that it completely disregards independent contractors, a term that companies like Uber have grown rather fond of because it means they don't have to give their workers basic rights or benefits, and that would extend to not having to pay healthcare taxes for each of those employees. This leaves the door open for companies to relabel their workers as contractors to avoid paying the head tax, or splitting their company into smaller firms in order to meet the 50 or less rule. By arbitrarily linking the tax to the number of employees, Warren's plan leaves a ton of loopholes open for employers to abuse.
So how does the Bernie plan fix this? Well, Bernie's plan relies on a payroll tax, which uses this genius thing called a percentage. Companies are taxed based on how much total money they pay out to workers, rather than how many workers there are. So it actually matters how much each of these people make. Let's go back to that 100-person company I used in Warren's plan. Under Bernie, 7.5% of the payroll would be taxed to fund Medicare. Say 90 of them are full-time minimum wage workers who earn roughly $15,000 a year. 9 of them are on the board of directors and earn $60,000 each, and the CEO earns $15 million a year. So add all that up, take 7.5%, and we have a tax of over $1.2 million. That's a few $100,000 more than the $950,000 the same company would pay under Warren's tax. And that's not even including the possible independent contractors that are on the payroll but not included under the Warren plan.
Obviously, I pretty much just made up a bunch of numbers to do some arbitrary math, but it shows that actually taking into account what each worker makes will raise more revenue from companies with rich as fuck CEOs while not punishing companies that have really tiny payrolls that can't even pay for each worker's benefits. In fact, if we pretended a company could exist that had nothing more than 100 minimum wage workers making $15,000 a year with no leadership roles or anything that make higher than that, that company would pay an enormous amount less under Bernie's plan than under Warren's plan. So when people are like, oh, Warren's plan doesn't raise taxes on the middle class like her campaign is, that's kind of bullshit, because her plan doesn't distinguish between high earners and low earners. Bernie's plan does. So to sum up that whole mess of a chapter, Bernie's plan would focus mainly on companies with high payrolls, while Warren's plan would disproportionately tax low-income workers. And even if you ignored all those funding differences, Bernie's plan is just more likely to pass in Congress because his plan is introduced before the midterms, while Warren's isn't introduced until 3 years into her term. Needless to say, Warren's plan isn't the winning strategy here. Before we hop into the plans proper, we need to talk about the nature of the housing problem. The US never really rebounded from the homelessness caused by the 2008 recession because the problems that created the recession in the first place really weren't adequately addressed. For this reason, people were often kicked out of their homes by foreclosures, and then the houses were never put back on the market, so they remain empty. People often think of homelessness as a supply issue where there's too many people, not enough homes, but that's inarguably, factually, objectively not true. Unoccupied homes outnumber homeless people at least 5 to 1 in the US. There are 5 times as many empty houses as there are homeless people. This is usually a result of the foreclosures I mentioned earlier. Banks will foreclose homes if tenants can't make their payments, and then they'll just never bother to put the home back on the market. It'll just sit there completely empty, benefiting nobody. On that note, I don't really think any of the candidates really attack the problem at its core, probably because it'd be seen as too far for the government to straight up just seize homes from banks and give them to people for free. Abolish the housing market. I think that's the answer, but we don't really live in a political climate where that's super feasible, and someone was watching and their stomach just started churning as soon as I said that. So I have 2 real estate agent parents, so I know that is an unpopular opinion. So although neither plan really satisfies me on that front, you probably already guessed that I'm gonna say the Warren plan is a teensy bit misguided.
Our housing problem in America is a problem on the supply side.
Liz, no, you don't get it. Just watch this Philosophy Tube video. I think you'd greatly benefit. The core conceit of her approach is that by building more homes, which we really don't need, rents will naturally go down through supply and demand, which is true. If you're wrong, supply and demand is a reasonably reliable trend, not a literal law. That means that in areas that this plan doesn't sufficiently invest in, it's the government, it's gonna happen. Rent's not gonna go down based on supply. Just like her climate change plan, Warren depends on the invisible hand of the market to fix a problem created by and inherent to the market. Instead of regulating rents directly, she decides to depend on economics laws that are taught to 8th graders to simplify capitalism. Why don't we just use the visible hand of regulation? You think you're safe? The other parts of the plan seem to check out to me. Strengthening the Fair Housing Act to limit discrimination, making it easier for borrowers to get mortgages, but the Sanders plan does so much more.
The most important component of Bernie's plan is the implementation of national rent control, which would place a cap on how much a landlord can increase rent per year. This would naturally be on the federal level, but states and cities would have the ability to implement even stronger restrictions if they wanted to. You know, actually regulating things instead of saying, the market will do it. It also implements a just cause requirement for evictions, meaning a landlord could only evict a tenant for specifically violating their contract, rather than just, kicking them out because they want to. There's a lot more too, like providing $2 billion in grants so states and localities— just pause and read the fucking list, I'm not voicing all that.
And there's even more that I just don't have room to cover, but basically Bernie is the housing candidate and there's no fucking contest. The sheer scale of the plan shows that Bernie understands homelessness as a problem born of greedy landlords, rising poverty, and discrimination, not just the myth of we don't have enough homes for people. The housing market is flawed, like really flawed, and the answer isn't to just reinvigorate it by dumping federal funds into the market hoping that supply and demand will sort it all out. That's a capitalist way of thinking, and just like it's not going to fix climate change, it's not going to fix homelessness. What we need is harsh regulation of property owners on behalf of tenants. We work to eliminate homelessness, treat it as a thing that can statistically be gotten rid of, because it can, instead of treating it as if it's some eventuality that we just have to try and limit. And maybe, just maybe, we eliminate the housing market because it inherently feeds off the existence. We're halfway through the policies. By now you know how this is gonna go. I'm gonna outline Warren's plan, show you why it's inadequate, and then tell you why Bernie's plan fills those inadequacies. Thankfully, this one's pretty easy and short, compared to the other ones.
The most important facet of Warren's plan is that it's means tested. It decides exactly how much debt is forgiven based on the debtor's household income. This comes in several levels. Every person with an income under $100,000, the vast majority of people, will see a cancellation of $50,000 in debt. Everyone between $100,000 and $250,000 in income is given, substantial debt cancellation at a level less than $50,000, leading up to no cancellation whatsoever for households above an income of $250,000. My presumed debt, once I graduate, will be completely wiped out, and Warren's team estimates that would be the case for 75% of students, with only 5% seeing no cancellation at all.
But we don't need to be stingy about this. As much as I'll advocate the guillotine all day, I do think that even rich people should be able to go to public school without incurring inhuman amounts of unpayable debt. Otherwise we get the same garbage divide where the beneficiaries are seen as freeloaders and we argue endlessly over who's deserving of the thing that I think should be a right.
On that note, Bernie's plan says fuck you, all of it. The US has $1.6 trillion in total student debt, and it grows every minute. This plan cancels every cent of it, funded by a combination of Bernie's wealth tax and a tax on buying and selling stocks on Wall Street, i.e. taxes that you probably won't be paying.
Plus, it's not like we're just giving handouts to a bunch of rich kids. The argument that the wealthy don't deserve debt relief because they can pay their debts completely ignores the fact that the vast majority of the taxes would be paid for by rich people. On a purely philosophical level, I'd argue this is the right plan. Debt relief is something that everyone should benefit from, regardless of class, especially if the idea is to eventually move toward a classless society. Just because debt doesn't ruin rich people's lives the way it ruins our lives doesn't mean I think they should be saddled with it too. I think debt as a concept is a bad thing. Besides, we're gonna take their money anyway. Oh, that could have been a good segue into the wealth tax section. Shit, maybe I should reorder the script. Now let's get into the part that you don't want to talk about, but we have to because it involves people dying. Both Bernie and Warren claim to want to cut military spending, and they argue that we've spent way too much time, money, and lives on endless foreign wars, something that you and I hopefully both agree with. And not just on the basis that, ooh, American soldiers dying in other countries is a bad thing. No, going out and killing people in other countries is also a problem. But for all that talk, Warren gushes about the military a lot, and her actual stated positions on certain foreign policy issues don't really line up with the image of a purely anti-interventionist diplomat.
First of all, she joined virtually every other candidate in saying that the recently established interim government of Bolivia should work to ensure the validity of Bolivia's democratic institutions, and that Bolivia needs to have free and fair elections moving forward. Which is to say, the absolute bare minimum you could say in this situation. Like, okay, this tweet is demanding the military not, kill protesters, which is objectively a good thing to ask for. But Warren's response doesn't even begin to tackle the fact that the new government was put there by a fucking military coup. I'm not here to outline the entire situation in Bolivia, because frankly this video is 16 years long already and there'll probably be more developments by the time it's out, but only one candidate has accurately described it as an illegitimate coup against a popular president. Unfortunately, she's kind of a warmongering cultist. Oh, hello. Warren has also condemned the idea of Donald Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un for denuclearization talks, and her reasoning is a tad flimsy.
I want to see our president succeed, because if he succeeds, America succeeds, the world is safer. But I am very worried that they're going to take advantage of him.
Hold on, you're afraid of diplomacy because you're scared that our warhawk president is going to be taken advantage of if he tries to do the not war thing. What is it that you want? Do you want him to be more aggressive in condemning an entire country to nuclear devastation?
Meanwhile, Bernie's critiques lied with Trump's sincerity, saying this.
I have no problem with him sitting down with Kim Jong-un in North Korea or any place else. But I don't want it simply to be a photo opportunity. The whole world's media was attracted there. What's going to happen tomorrow and the next day?
This is a fair fear to have. It hits Trump for being the dishonest, attention-seeking fucko he is. It doesn't attack the very idea of diplomacy simply because Trump's the one engaging in it.
I don't think I need to tell you that trying to diplomatically get a dictator to give up some level of power is a good thing, and that bombing the fuck out of them is a bad thing, actually. Even though the Hanoi and Singapore talks went remarkably terribly, and neither country gave up anything, and God, I fucking hate foreign policy, even despite all that, the idea of the talks, maybe not the content, but the idea of the talks is one of the more commendable things that the Trump administration has pursued. Yet somehow a frightening amount of Democrats yelled at Trump for negotiating with a dictator, which is an attack from the right. They sure as hell weren't yelling at Obama for negotiating the Iran nuclear deal in agreement with the same goals as the North Korea talks. Warren's overt condemnation of this attempt at diplomacy doesn't explicitly paint her as a war hawk, but it is a little worrying that she seems to toe the national line of negotiation with our enemies is pointless. Just shake our nuclear sticks at them until they sit down. Now let's talk about how she's definitely in love with the military. So I'm just going to assume you already know our military budget's horrifically inflated and we spend more than the next 8 countries combined, and that even if we didn't, wanting to increase funding for an institution historically dedicated to destabilizing other countries for profit would be a bad thing. Anyway, Warren voted to increase the military budget in 2015, 2016, and 2017.
Here's the thing, she's all over the place with this. Until 2018, she consistently voted in favor of the final versions of military budget bills, but sometimes she votes against early versions, like in 2016. And look, there's a myriad of reasons her stance would change on a bill. Maybe she voted in favor of the final bills because they lowered spending relative to the first draft of the bill. But the fact still remains that she's consistently voted in favor of bills that went on to dramatically increase military spending. The most jarring of these was in 2017, where she voted in favor of the only Senate draft of Trump's first military budget, which increased spending even higher than Trump asked for. But in 2018, we saw a shift, in which she voted against the final draft of the military spending bill for the first time in her Senate career. I legitimately don't know what to make of this. Maybe she's always been against high military spending, and there were just weird, pragmatic reasons her votes have been so erratic. Or maybe this was just a cynical pivot to increase her chances in the primaries. One thing's for sure, her answers on it don't help.
You have focused a lot on progressive domestic policy. You also voted for a military budget increase in 2017. How does that square with your progressive politics when we're talking about foreign policy?
If the question is, do I think we should cut the military budget, the answer is yes.
Liz! It took you literally 4 words to rephrase the question. You know that's not what she was asking. Jesus fucking Christ, how do people think you're the honest politician? I'm not gonna play the whole clip because it's a lot of unrelated fluffery about corruption. Okay, it's legitimate criticism of corruption in the military-industrial complex, but needless to say, she never answers the actual original question. The fact of the matter is, she voted for a drastic increase in the military budget, and she can't defend that vote from a progressive viewpoint, so she just pretends she was asked something else. That's not someone I trust to aggressively fight to cut military spending. Anyway, you've already guessed that Bernie's consistently voted against military budgets for years. Moving on!
Warren has continuously shown that although she claims to want spending cuts, she really likes the military. She often uses her brother's military service as an applause getter at town halls. I'm not going to fault her for that, for saying troops good. That's pretty par the course for most politicians. But she has shown her priorities in ways that are equally infuriating and just hilarious.
Climate change is real. It's worsening by the day, and it's undermining our military readiness. More and more, accomplishing the mission depends on our ability to continue operations in the face of floods, drought, wildfires, desertification, and extreme cold. Hey Liz, I didn't think I'd need to say this, but climate change is going to kill us all! We're all gonna fucking die, and you're sitting here saying,
oh no, climate change is making it harder for our military to turn foreign lead into the war zones.
Now, people don't usually provide the context for that tweet, mostly because it's unbelievably fucking stupid and no amount of context could redeem it, but she was trying to promote a plan to move the military, the government's largest polluter, to an environmentally friendly energy system. That's fine, I guess, but I feel like one of the first steps in keeping the military from polluting is probably to slash its budget a bit. Just a little. Here's another mind-blowingly stupid thing.
Senator Warren, only about 1% of Americans serve in the United States military right now. Should that number be higher?
Yes, I think it should be. I remember what it was like when I was a little girl, my oldest brother, and what it was like for my mother every day to check the mailbox. Had we heard from Don Reed? How's he doing? And if there was a letter, she was brighter than the day. And if it wasn't, she'd say, well, maybe tomorrow.
Do I even need to bother anymore? That one explains itself. She just loves fucking military.
But it doesn't stop there, gamers. She also likes ICE.
You know, ICE? An agency whose acronym might as well be Internment and Concentration Eternally. The department that has been in the news for basically the entirety of 2019 for shoving immigrants, undocumented and otherwise, into literal concentration camps, and whose primary objective is deportation. Honestly, if I have to convince you that ICE is bad, I'm surprised you've made it this far in the video. If you don't already know, just pause the video for 4 seconds and do some Googling. Anyway, here's what our pal Lizzie McGuire has to say about it.
We need ICE and Custom and Border Patrol. It is focused on real threats from terrorism, threats, container shipping that comes into the United States, contraband that we need to worry about, fentanyl.
Oh my fucking god.
One day I want to do some kind of video on immigration and the Latin American war on drugs. This is on your homework list, by the way. But for now, I'll leave it at this. The answer to ICE isn't focusing it on legitimate threats. It's abolishing the damn agency because it's been a tool for terrorizing immigrant and Latinx communities since its inception. Warren saying we just need to use it better is not reassuring, to say the least. And yet again, we don't need to settle for simple reforms when Bernie's plan includes pausing deportations and abolishing ICE altogether. All of this rampant support of the military, saying we need more soldiers, casting the military as one of the big victims of climate change, consistently voting to increase spending, and supporting the institution that is currently putting people in concentration camps is not progressive or left-wing by any measure of the word. Being progressive isn't just about taxing the rich and making social programs. It's about treating every human being with fucking dignity, including those outside our country. Well, maybe not every human. I'll begin by acknowledging that the idea of a wealth tax is still pretty new in the US, especially in how mainstream it's become today. So on that front, both Warren and Bernie are pioneers for talking about it at all, because God knows these fucks aren't. And whatever form that wealth tax takes, it'll be able to fund pretty much every program in both their platforms, and cut the wealth of billionaires drastically over the next 10 years. But like with everything else, Bernie's plan just goes so much farther, it's insane how much more we'd be able to fund with it. And it all comes down to brackets.
This image from Business Insider shows the basics of the plans, though we need to make a small adjustment according to Warren's Medicare for All plan. I think it sums it up pretty succinctly if you understand how marginal taxes work. If you're like me and have no fucking clue, let's have Google do the work.
Hey Google, how much would Bill Gates pay under the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax?
According to Barron's, it turns out Bill Gates wouldn't pay $100 billion under Sen. Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, after all.
Sen. I had a scripted bit, but it fucking said Sen. Why is that so funny? Okay, give me a sec to figure out how the fuck tax brackets work. Okay, I've got it. Hey Google, what's 109 billion times 0.06 plus 950 million times 0.02?
The answer is 2.26459 times 10 to the power of 13.
That's not true. It put zeros instead of points. What did it do? 109 billion times 206. That's not what I said, you garbage fucking wiretap!
Under the Warren wealth tax, Bill Gates, who has a net worth of $110 billion at time of recording, would pay a total of $6,559 million a year, which is definitely nothing to sneeze at. But let's take a look at Bernie's plan.
Hey Google, what's 100 billion times 0.08 plus 5 billion times 0.07 plus 2.5 billion times 0.06 plus 1.5 billion times 0.05 plus 500 million times 0.04 plus 250 million times 0.03 plus 200 million times 0.02 plus 18 million times 0.01?
The answer is 1,749,843,000,000.
No, it's not. Bill Gates will not be paying over $1 trillion under the wealth tax. That's not how taxes work. Even if it could calculate that, there's absolutely no way it would get the order of operations right.
Under the Sanders wealth tax, Gates would pay $8,606,680 a year, just over $2 billion more than under Warren's plan. Just so you don't lose track of how much money that is and the scale of it all, I want to point out that $2 billion is how much it would cost to house 1/10 of the homeless people in the United States. That's a lot of fucking money. A lot of useful fucking money. And that's just one guy. Imagine how much that'll raise when you consider the sheer quantity of millionaires and billionaires there are.
Again, I feel like the sheer scale of that kind of difference is completely lost on people when you talk about inhumanly large amounts of money. Their eyes like glaze over and they physically can't actually fathom how big a number is. Ooh, Bernie's is more radical, but Warren's is still pretty radical. Like, no, that's a $1.5 trillion difference. Trillion. That's 1,000 billions. That's 1,000,000 millions. That's so much money that even in fiction, there are no trillionaires except Scrooge McFucking McDuck. Warren's plan funds a lot of things and raises a ton of money, and that's all well and good. That's what we need. But Bernie's plan is about making sure that no single individual can reach $110 billion in wealth ever again. You can talk about the American dream all you want. You are not reaching that American dream. I'm of the objectively correct, and you cannot argue with me, belief that billionaires as an existing thing are immoral. Given the amount of poverty, debt, starvation, homelessness, Flint fucking Michigans in this country that define our class divide, it is profane that there are individuals with enough money to solve any one or two or three of these problems, and they just don't. Because we allow them the free will to use and hoard their money however they wish out of some sense of freedom? If you don't agree with that, you're either overly trusting in the free market, in which case I have no idea how you've made it this far in the video, or you don't know how much $1 billion actually is, which is fair. I didn't really know until this year. I hadn't been conscious of it, at least. If you asked me to write down the math, I would do it, but I wouldn't fathom how much money that actually is, and that is an important sense of scale to have.
$1 million is a lot for one person to have, right? 1 billion is 1,000 times that. Bill Gates has $110 billion. Now let me rephrase that. Bill Gates has $110,000 million. You and me will probably not be millionaires, at least until that amazing retirement plan kicks in at 65. We will not reach 1/110,000th what the richest man in the world has, no matter how hard we work, because the system says he works harder than us. Apparently he works 110,000 times harder than us, and that's assuming we're worth $1 million. No amount of charity donations can atone for the fact that this man has enough money to end homelessness not once, but 5 times over and still have $10 fucking billion left. Especially when those charity donations typically act as a little more than tax write-offs. When Forbes writes a glowing article about Jeff Bezos donating nearly $100 million to fight homelessness, that's not generosity. That's someone who can eradicate the problem using less than an actual fifth of his wealth, claiming a tax write-off.
Billionaires should not exist. Bernie Sanders knows this, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knows this, and they're waking up millions of people to the idea that obscene wealth is an immoral product of an unjust system. I'm to the left of Bernie on this issue. I think there should be a straight-up wealth cap. 100% of all earnings above a certain level, all wealth above this point, should be taxed to go to social programs. So I'm more radical than Bernie, but I probably wouldn't have had that initial epiphany of billionaires shouldn't exist if it weren't for Bernie Sanders. Anyway, Elizabeth Warren, just play the fucking clip.
Bernie Sanders says there should be no billionaires. Do you agree with that?
No.
Why not?
Look, somebody has a great idea and they follow it through and they work hard and they build something. Good for them.
Okay, liberal. This answer doesn't even slightly surprise me at this point. For one, the idea that billionaires are bad actually isn't really mainstream in electoral politics in the sense that most candidates are embracing it. In fact, most are just treating it as a death sentence. Bernie's the only one embracing it as the rhetoric we need to win this election. And for 3, it really shouldn't be a revelation by this point that she likes to talk a big progressive game, but then add that little footnote caveat that she doesn't want that kind of change. But she sure will pretend she does. Pretend she does. Pretend she does. But she sure will pretend she does.
Listen, this shit's $25 US. Did you honestly think I was gonna buy it? This mug was added to the Warren campaign shop 4 days after she told Amy Goodman she thought billionaires were okay. It's the perfect microcosm of her entire presidential run. The juxtaposition of this with this in the span of less than a week. The fucking shameless insincerity you have to possess to try and appeal to both class-minded people like me and rugged individualists who think billionaires earned what they have. The sheer fucking audacity to straight up concede that you aren't as left as you pretend to be, only to immediately release a piece of merchandise as if to conduct damage control. Even if she's completely sincere in her needlessly restrained healthcare plan, in her needlessly restrained college debt forgiveness, in her needlessly restrained wealth tax, this coffee mug, this single fucking coffee mug, unmasks the two faces of her campaign. She's trying to sell you a vision for America that I've based my entire worldview on, that I believe in with every fiber of my being. The vision she's selling is the one I wholeheartedly wish everyone would buy, but it's one that I discovered through Bernie Sanders. I've spent this entire election cycle shrieking about the obnoxious fucking centrists who have no principles other than we need to defeat Trump, when poverty didn't exactly start under Trump. I considered Elizabeth Warren different from them, or at least more honest. I considered her a voice we needed, one that was backing up all the correct things Bernie Sanders has been saying since the 70s. I never planned on voting for her, but I felt like I understood why a lefty like me would. Like a lot of people, I considered her a slightly less radical version of Bernie, when in reality she has a completely different approach to politics, one that's willing to break under pressure and bend away from the principles that brought her to the national stage in the first place. She manages to repackage progressivism into a less bold, neutered version of what it could and should be, sacrificing big structural change for a contrived appeal to both the left and the imaginary moderate. Whether or not she actually believes in the progressive vision that she bases her branding on, she's been pivoting further to the center ever since I finished this script. I've based my worldview on the belief that in a country where obscene amounts of wealth are allowed to flow into the hands of just a few rich fuckos, it is equally obscene that I can't go to the doctor because I live off student loans and my parents would have to rearrange their entire budget to account for a single medical visit. It is obscene that I'm going to graduate from a public, government-funded university tens of thousands of dollars in debt. It is obscene that basic necessities like food, water, housing aren't available to those who don't have a job and are barely affordable to those who do. It is obscene that we as a species are about to fucking drown in a process that's going to become irreversible in the next 10 years, and it is obscene that it's considered radical to ask the richest people on the planet to fund the effort to save it. These are all things Elizabeth Warren claims to believe, while pushing a healthcare bill seemingly built to be destroyed by the Republicans, only wiping out some student debt because God forbid rich people benefit from a public good, and depending on the market to fix housing and environmental crises synonymous with the market itself. To be completely honest, I'm filming this bit nearly 2 months after I filmed the rest of it, so I'll just be blunt and say I'm kinda mad I wasn't able to cover the whole sexism story, or Warren saying that whoever gets the most votes shouldn't necessarily be the nominee, we should let the process work itself out, or how she flip-flopped on super PACs saying that if the men have them, so should the women. Real progressive move there. In short, this video is coming out way later than I wanted it to, so most of you have probably already voted, and considering you're watching me, you've already voted for Bernie, but if you haven't, I just want to say this. If you call yourself a lefty, or very liberal, or whatever, I urge you to consider just how aggressive we need to be to combat the structural problems that have been baked into our country since its inception, and to vote for the one candidate who has been calling out those problems not since the 2000s or since it was politically convenient, but since he was in college. I urge you to consider that political revolution is exactly what we need right now, and only one candidate has built his entire rhetorical strategy around that very phrase. And only one candidate has focused his campaign on inspiring non-voters who don't feel represented in American politics to actually get out and vote this time around. Right now, we have the chance to elect a front-runner candidate who's actually diagnosing our deep-rooted systemic problems as systemic, rather than simply as bad decisions by individuals. And if we compromise that because we decide someone else is more electable, or God forbid we think a weaker candidate is exactly the same as the bolder candidate, who do we have to blame when we don't get real change on behalf of regular people like us? My name is Cameron, and I hereby endorse Bernie Sanders for President of the United States. Now I just need the campaign to contact me so I can condense this entire 55-minute thing to one of their little 1-minute, like, Dick Van Dyke style endorsement videos. An hour of this. 3 months of working on this thing. 3 months! Countless hours of my life! And Warren lost to Amy Klobuchar in New Hampshire. Hey fellas, thank you for watching. This is where I'd envision the Patreon credits going by, but I don't have a Patreon or enough people to justify starting one. Let me know if you want to give me money. I just want to say thank you for sitting through this hour-long monster. And for those of you who follow me on Twitter, enduring the constant tweets about a video that seemingly was never going to come, it's here. I did it. Finally. And it's going to be pointless in the grand scheme of things. This is where I'm supposed to plug all my social things. You can follow me on Twitter. I ramble about the videos, post screenshots sometimes. You can follow me on Instagram. I post even less about video things, and sometimes I shriek about current events, and I stream video games on Twitch. And if you want, you can go watch my last video, which is an analysis of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from a political lefty perspective. The next video won't be an hour long, I promise. Okay, bye. You know, the outro should probably be a thing that I script, but instead I just scream. Oh no, the recording's gonna end in 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, that's not 5.